Ieuan and the Fleece, Part 1, Chapter 4, The Argonauts. The next morning, Jason woke early in his bed at the palace. He went to the kitchens and found himself some bread and meat, then headed down to the harbour. It didn't take him long to find Argo, the best boat builder in the land, who was hard at work with an axe, shaping a massive timber. Argo paused in his work, greeting Jason with a wave. Jason's arrival the previous day was already the talk of the town, and he guessed the reason for Jason seeking him out. The boat on which Argo was working was almost finished, and he claimed it was the best boat he had ever built. As Argo continued to work, he and Jason discussed the trip Jason planned. The king, although hoping that the adventure would be a failure, and even that Jason would not return, had agreed to finance the expedition and stock the boat with food for the journey. It wasn't long before men started to appear wanting to join the crew, and within a week not only was the great boat completed, but a mighty band of heroes and warriors had gathered to sail her. The day had arrived for sailing, and as all the crew gathered on the beach, they had two questions. What was the name of the ship, and who was to be her captain? The men shouted for Argo, who had built the ship, but he refused, saying he was a craftsman, not a master. Then they called for Hercules for captain, as the strongest amongst them. He too refused, saying that his path would lead elsewhere in the future, and that the captain could only be one person, Jason. The crew readily agreed with his choice, and so Jason was made captain. His first job was to name the ship. What else but the Argo after her builder, he declared to the cheering crowd. Now, in a big boat driven by oars, it is much easier and more comfortable for those sitting in the centre than for those nearer the bow or stern, so the men drew lots for the benches where they would sit. When all was ready, weapons, armour and clothing were put aboard, and with a great heave the Argo was pushed down the beach and into the sea. Every day the men rowed, and on some days they hoisted the big square sail, although those days were rare. The ship could only sail with the wind, and although it normally blew from the west at this time of year, it often seemed to be against them, and so they rowed. What Jason had never told his men was that he had offended Zeus, the king of their gods, and he suspected that lack of favourable winds might be connected with the god. That, though, said Cadno to his eager audience, is a story that will wait for another time. Each day they rowed, always keeping in sight of land, and each evening looking for a quiet cove where they could anchor overnight. Sometimes they landed near a town or village, and they spoke to the people asking for any information about the route east. All who they met were friendly, but could tell them little about the lands to the east, except as far as the next small port. For 3 weeks they travelled like this, until the day came that there were no longer islands in sight when the sun started to head for his rest, and it looked like they would have to spend the night on the open sea. This is not something sailors like to do. No one knows what might happen in the dark, where the ship may drift. The lack of visible land in the evening doesn't mean that a sudden wind might not crash a ship against a rocky shore before morning. The best they could do was listen very closely to the sound of the sea, carefully noting any changes which might indicate breaking waves or the nearness of land. The Argo survived the night without incident, and in the morning they still saw no sign of a coastline. They rowed through the day, the wind having dropped, and all through that day the sun beat down on the men of the Argo. As the day came to an end and the light faded, they saw land to the east, and so the tired rowers pulled hard on the oars and headed towards it. It was almost dark as they dropped the anchor stone near the shore. They needed fresh water, but didn't want to risk landing on an unknown island in the dark, and, not knowing what sort of reception the inhabitants might give to late visitors, Jason decided they should remain aboard overnight and land in the morning. People on the island saw the ship arrive, though, and hurried away to tell their queen. Cadno reached for the mead cup beside him and took a long draught before continuing. Ieuan was fascinated by Cadno's story, as he had been by previous ones. There were many things he didn't really understand. He had never seen the sea. The river that flowed just below the village went to the sea. Was it the same sea? And islands. There were islands in the river in the summer, but you didn't need a big boat to get to them, and none of them would be big enough to live on. So much more he wanted to understand, but Cadno had started to speak again.